Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief. You're listening to us on RCP radio, well, really Sirius XM radio, or maybe on our podcast. Joined now by Aaron Maté, a RealClear Investigations reporter, a terrific investigative reporter from California. As a story, it was on RealClear Investigations, but we put it as a lead story on RealClear Politics this morning. And the headline is Russiagate's architects suppress doubts to peddle false claim. It's another look at these original investigations that led to Robert Mueller, John Durham investigations, Senate reports, Trump impeachment, all kinds of stuff flowed out of it. But, Aaron, as I look at this, I'm going to ask you about your story in a minute. Tulsi Gabbard put out a version of it, and the new CIA director is, and they seem a little bit, sort of a counter narrative that's almost the opposite of what was the dominant narrative for a while. I'm sort of skeptical of both of them, but this does look, the more we look into this, and you've been looking at this for years, there was really much less to this association, alleged association between Vladimir Putin and the Trump campaign than we were led to believe. A lot less, wasn't there?
Absolutely. Trump calls it a hoax, and I think that's an accurate statement. Now,
really,
absolutely. I mean, we know by now that the collusion aspect was completely baseless. There was nothing there. I mean, nobody defends that anymore, the collusion angle of this. The basis for the investigation, which the FBI claimed was a tip about George Papadopoulos, a low-level campaign volunteer, that appears to be, by all accounts, just an excuse to cover up the real predicate for the investigation, which looks to be the Steele dossier, which is funded by Hillary Clinton, a collection of debunked conspiracy theories. But regardless, nobody defends the notion anymore that there was some sort of high-level conspiracy between Trump's campaign and Russia, which was the basis for the FBI's investigation and the Mueller probe. But the enduring allegation has been what Mueller described as a sweeping and systematic Russian interference campaign on Trump's behalf to put Trump in office and defeat Hillary Clinton. And what we're reporting now in RealClear Investigations, based on these newly classified documents, is that the U.S. intelligence community that put out Mueller's allegations and that, put forward this notion of a sweeping Russian interference operation, they suppressed high-level doubts from the two premier intelligence agencies that were investigating this, the FBI, which took the lead in the Trump-Russia investigation, and the NSA, which would be the intelligence agency best placed to identify who actually hacked the DNC, the Democratic Party servers, and gave them to WikiLeaks, because that was the allegation, along with collusion, that was at the heart of Russiagate. The allegation that Russia hacked the DNC basically kicked off Russiagate when it was first lodged by the Clinton campaign through their contractor, CrowdStrike. And what we're reporting on now is new documents showing that in September 2016, as the Russian interference allegations are heating up, the FBI and the NSA broke from their counterparts in CIA and said, we have low confidence that Russia hacked the DNC and then released that material through online personas, as well as WikiLeaks. That's the allegation here that's at the heart of Russian interference claims. And what we're saying is, we're only learning now, more than 8 years later, that the FBI and the NSA had low confidence in that assertion.
All right. So I remember the original entity was supposed to be something called Guccifer 2.0.
Yeah.
And this was some Romanian hacker, we were told. I don't know what to believe anymore. But okay. But the DNC servers were hacked. So if Russia didn't do it, who did it?
Well, the point that someone like Julian Assange has made, who, by the way, was never interviewed by Robert Mueller or any other U.S. investigator, he said that, it's quite possible that foreign states, including Russia, were hacked into the Democratic Party servers. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were the ones that were responsible for exfiltrating that information, giving it to WikiLeaks, and being responsible for it being made public. Because espionage, cyber meddling happens all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean that leads to exfiltration. And there's so much evidence now that U.S. officials, along with this low confidence dissent we're just learning about now from the NSA and FBI, didn't have the evidence that these alleged Russian hackers that were in the DNC actually took anything. And we know that, for example, from CrowdStrike, which was the firm working for Hillary Clinton, which was the first entity to accuse Russia of hacking the DNC. And CrowdStrike's president, Sean Henry, admitted in congressional testimony that also was buried for years, that CrowdStrike had no evidence that alleged Russian hackers actually exfiltrated anything from the servers. So basically, they had no evidence that if Russian hackers, if they were in the DNC, actually took anything out.
And, all right, but there was stuff that got out because it was leaked to the press, and we found out very interesting tidbits, like the DNC had placed a mole in Bernie Sanders' campaign that, presumably they were trying to steer things to Clinton. There were little tidbits like that. Nothing, no criminal behavior, but not great behavior. John Podesta, some of his emails were leaked. And, it didn't make the Democrats look great. Yeah. It made some of the Bernie Sanders people angry, and justifiably, because the DNC is supposed to be neutral in an open election like that. But so how did WikiLeaks get this information? If Russia didn't give them to them, who did?
That's the question. And I think we've been prevented from getting a real answer because there was a narrative decided upon very early to blame Russia, even though the evidence for it wasn't there. So we have the suppression of this low confidence assessment from the FBI and the NSA. That's in September. Then a few weeks later, the Obama administration still puts out on October 7th a statement saying that the U.S. intelligence community is confident that Russia was behind the hack and release of the Democratic Party emails. Now, it's notable that if you look at that statement, the NSA and the FBI are not on it. It's the Department of Homeland Security, which is run by Jay Johnson at the time, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which was done by James Clapper. And so they put out a statement that contradicted what the FBI and the NSA were saying privately. And then according to these new declassified documents from Tulsi Gabbard, the NSA and the FBI's descent continued because even after the election, by early December, another memo was circulated internally saying that at this point, most U.S. intelligence agencies only have moderate confidence that Russia was behind the hack and release of the DNC. And in the internal correspondence about this, the FBI was still dissenting and was still refusing to put its name on any sort of attribution to Russia. Now, something then happens that's very, very important. On December 9th, you have a high-level meeting at the White House convened by Obama with all of his top national security principals, including Brennan and Clapper. And funnily enough, the FBI and the NSA are invited, but they're not represented by their leaders, James Comey and Mike Rogers. And at that meeting, according to notes newly declassified by Tulsi Gabbard, they decide, okay, we're going to put out a new report making a public attribution to Russia. So this is where my speculation comes in. I think at that point, this is after Trump has won. The controversy around Russia is swirling. There's an effort at this point to taint Trump with Russia. It really ramps up after he wins. I think at that point it was decided we're going to blame Russia. And somehow the dissent from the FBI and the NSA was overcome because a month later, when a new intelligence assessment was put out to the public with the FBI and the NSA involved, now all of a sudden that low confidence had changed from high confidence. But we have no way of knowing what changed in the FBI and the NSA. How did they go from saying we have low confidence in this Russian hack and leak allegation to high confidence? They've never, ever explained that.
Aaron, I have a couple of questions I want to ask you, and the theories of mine, really. And the first is, I was thinking this the other day in a completely different context. The New York Times had a story about the Democrats are doing an autopsy of how they lost in 2024. And there were all these things they weren't going to look at. They weren't going to look at whether Biden should have been the nominee. They weren't going to look at Kamala Harris. They weren't going to look at, whether comparing to Hitler, Trump to Hitler for 9 years backfired, bit him in the ass. They're not going to look at any of the interesting things, right? But that's actually what political parties do. You have these retrospectives, and it's mostly just covering your ass. It's not really trying to get to the heart of it. Nobody likes to admit their own faults. That's human nature. Hillary Clinton, when she lost to Trump, this was an ignominious defeat. She thought he was legitimately thought he was unworthy, and she was much better prepared to be president. I agreed with that, actually, personally. She'd been Secretary of State. She lived in the White House. She'd been a senator from New York. She was a policy wonk. To me, she was one of the most highly qualified nominees in history, and Trump had never even run for dog catcher. Plus, she thought he was a singularly unpleasant person. So I get her view. She didn't want to think she should have lost to this guy, and so she put out she started she blamed sexism. She blamed low educated voters. She blamed Russia. Yeah. And I think what happened, my own theory of this is this had metastasized Hillary's, I won't say alibi, but her thinking had permeated this way. They needed somebody to blame. And as you say, and they weren't too fond of Trump. And so you could do both these things at one time. You could kind of taint Trump. You could give Hillary Clinton an excuse, and you could also send a shot across Russia's bow because Obama had famously dismissed Russia as a threat when he ran against Romney. He realized that was a mistake and later acknowledged it. You could do all these things. And it began as a political sort of exercise. And it became like a narrative, as you say. And they all bought into it and they were convinced of it and they convinced themselves of it. Anyway, what do you think of that?
I fully agree. And I would take it further. There was a convergence of interest in blaming Russia for Trump rather than looking at other reasons. So it starts, as you say, with the Democratic Party. Hillary Clinton campaign, they felt it was their turn. I mean, like that was the slogan. It's her turn, right? This presidency was theirs. It was taken from them. And they certainly had contempt for Trump voters. Hillary Clinton, after all, dismissed people as deplorables. And so we know, according to the book Shattered, which was an insider account of the Clinton campaign, that immediately they decided to blame Russia rather than looking at Hillary Clinton's own record.
Oh, would you know that started as early as the convention? Do you remember Trump said it was about the emails? And he said maybe Russia can release them. Trump had this line. They were already sort of putting that in the water stream beforehand.
Well, yeah. In fact, one of the things we learned in the first Trump term, when it comes to disclosures about Russiagate, was that John Ratcliffe, he declassified notes from John Brennan, the director of the CIA, who in July of 2016, just as the Russia investigation is beginning, he wrote that U.S. intelligence had picked up Russian intelligence, becoming aware of a supposed plot from Hillary Clinton to tie Trump to Russia. And Brennan warned Obama about this, and even then in September, sent a criminal referral to the FBI saying that you should be aware of this, that we have intelligence that Russia is aware of some sort of Clinton plot to frame Trump as in cahoots with Russia and Russia being involved in interference. Now, funnily enough, James Comey, in congressional testimony, he was asked about that referral. Hey, do you remember being told by the CIA that they have intelligence about a Clinton plot to tie Trump to Russia? And Comey said, doesn't ring any bells.
Think about that. Hey, look, and we got one more minute. I want to ask you the last question because we talked about this on our program earlier this week on Monday. Tom Bevan and Andy Walworth and I talked about it. But if you're looking for who to blame for this mess, Republicans blame Democrats, Democrats blame the Russians. You're trying to sort it out and figure out exactly what happened. But I want to turn back the clock to December 9th, that meeting at the White House. And I'll tell you who I blame. I blame the media. And I'll tell you why. So immediately after that meeting, Obama said, "All right, we're going to change direction here. Go with me on this for a minute. Just assume Obama's acting in good faith. He really thinks Putin's out to do bad things, and he's a partisan Democrat, but he's not spinning a conspiracy. He's really trying to do it right within the parameters." And they start leaking this information right away. It starts leaking. The Washington Post, New York Times. What bothers me about it is that the media wasn't, and these leaks, this is leaking classified information. It's a crime, not for the Washington Post, New York Times, but for these people. And none of these people, and some of them are my friends, Aaron, expressed any skepticism at all. They accepted this narrative hook, line, and sinker. They're defending it to this day. Glenn Kessler did a fact check on Tulsi Gabbard this very day in the Washington Post. And God bless him, Glenn. I love Glenn Kessler, but these people, they were never skeptical of it. They bought in a way that they compromised themselves. And I think if they had been more skeptical and they had written about what was really going on and looked at the stuff you have looked at and Paul Sperry and just sort of been even-handed about it, you would have had it would have been much more difficult for the Democrats to spin this. And you might have even saved them from themselves. They would have pulled back a little bit. Anyway, 30 seconds. What do you think of that?
I fully agree with you. There was no skepticism, especially on what was a conspiracy theory that Trump and Russia were in cahoots. Trump was being blackmailed. And there was no skepticism of that at all. There were fawning profiles written in, smart liberal journals like the New Yorker about Christopher Steele. What a wonderful, brave person he was. He tried to blow the whistle. I mean, it was a complete farce. I've also never seen anything like it. At least with Saddam Hussein and Iraq WMDs, you can understand why someone might buy into that because Saddam Hussein was a pretty evil person. Okay, but this was a conspiracy theory and the most mainstream conspiracy theory that I've ever seen, and there was no skepticism whatsoever. And yeah. On December 9th, the same day of that Obama meeting at the White House with his top principals, later on, the Washington Post publishes a story based on some sort of secret CIA assessment that Putin intervened in the election to help Trump. There was actually, as we newly confirmed with these documents, no such assessment. And
well, I remember thinking that I read that story on the spot and thought it was very thin. All right, I'm going to leave you with this last bit of wisdom. I'm talking to Aaron Maté, investigative reporter, and I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief. But Aaron and I are old school, and when we were coming up in journalism, we were taught If your mother says she loves you, check it out.
Amen.